The debt empire. Who does the world actually owe? Grab a cup of coffee and let's chat, because today we're going to talk about something that will bend your mind a bit but also open your eyes. That famous second-by-second compounding global debt mess. You've definitely seen it on the news. America's debt has crossed $38 trillion. The European Union is carrying $14 trillion in debt. Japan is practically crushing under nearly $9 trillion, and so on. But it's not just them. Even oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia or export powerhouses like Germany and China are swimming in massive amounts of debt. Now, are you ready for the absolute mind-bending part of this? If literally everyone is in debt, who exactly do we owe? Who is this mysterious creditor who apparently owns everything? You might not believe it, but the answer is actually shocking. Nobody. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes it to itself. Of course, this doesn't mean everyone gets an equal piece of the pie. How on earth did we as a planet sink into a $315 trillion debt trap, which is nearly 3 times the size of our entire global economy? And how does this system manage to generate another $1 trillion in debt every single 100 days? Let's travel back in time together to where this beautiful madness all began. It all started with a war, because of course it did. Centuries ago, long before digital transfers or credit cards existed, countries could only spend as much gold as they actually had in their vaults. Naturally, this made things incredibly difficult when major wars came knocking on the door. The year 1694. England is fighting France and is officially running out of money. There's basically no gold left. The solution. The king knocks on the doors of wealthy merchants. Give me gold now, and in return I'll pay you regular interest backed by the taxes I'll collect from the public in the future, he says. And the government bond is born. To organize and manage this deal, the Bank of England is created. This was revolutionary. The state had just discovered the power to spend money it didn't even have yet. In return, the promise to pay, the bond, given to the merchants, became a priceless, tradable asset that could be bought and sold on the market. France copied this system immediately, and the Netherlands polished and refined it further. The newly independent United States eagerly grabbed onto this exact method, first to fund its revolution, and later to finance its westward expansion. Suddenly, the ability to borrow became a badge of prestige and credibility rather than a mark of failure. The power to borrow became the power to rule. Empires used to conquer land to plunder gold. Now they issued bonds to collect interest. The battlefield migrated to the balance sheet. The America is China's hostage myth is actually total nonsense. Today, when people think of debt, they immediately think of the U.S. because its debt isn't just national, it's global. But who is actually holding the other end of that massive $38 trillion rope? Roughly half of that debt is publicly held, meaning it's owed to investors outside of government agencies. And here is the funny part. Almost 2/3 of those investors are Americans themselves. We are talking about their own banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve, Fed itself. The remaining 1/3, about $9 trillion, is held by foreign hands. The biggest chunk, around $1 trillion, belongs to Japan. China follows them, with about $800 billion. Behind them are the UK, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So, that popular theory of if China demanded its money back tomorrow, America would collapse, is pure fiction. China's share is only about 2% of the total debt. In reality, America mostly owes money to America. You pay taxes, the government uses those taxes to pay interest on bonds, and that interest flows right back into your own retirement accounts. It's a circular mirror. This loop works globally too. Japan buys U.S. Treasury bonds, lending money to the U.S. The U.S. provides funding to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends money to developing nations. Those developing nations in turn park the cash they earn back into Western bonds to keep it safe. We are basically all players at a poker table who have borrowed chips from one another. There's only one rule. Nobody gets up from the table. Democracy decides, markets rule. Behind this giant system sit incredibly powerful players. Hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks. They are the true arbiters of credit. They decide which country gets to borrow cheaply, and which country has to bleed just to survive. If they lose confidence for even a moment, currencies collapse and governments fall. In other words, democracy decides who governs, but the markets decide who survives. And the high priests at the very top of this system are the central banks. They don't just manage debt, they manufacture it out of thin air. Every time the Federal Reserve, Fed, or the European Central Bank, ECB, buys a government bond, they create brand new money in return. The liability of one balance sheet becomes the asset of another. To put it simply, there is no such thing as debt-free money. Every single bill in your wallet, every digital cent in your bank account has a promise to pay, invisibly engraved on its surface. What happens when confidence cracks? This entire system relies on one thing: everyone trusting that governments will pay their interest. Not the principal, just the interest. But what happens when that trust wavers? We've seen some painful examples of this in recent history. Greece, 2010. The government's debt became completely unpayable. Investors panicked, and interest rates spiked. The ECB and the IMF stepped in to save them, but the price tag was brutal. Taxes skyrocketed, spending was slashed, and mass unemployment hit. For an entire generation, bailout became synonymous with sacrifice and ruin. Argentina. They defaulted on their debts over and over again, turning debt into a chronic national curse. Sri Lanka. Quite recently, they ran out of the foreign currency needed to pay their external loans. The country ran out of fuel. Chaos erupted and the government collapsed. When the system clogs up, those invisible creditors, the IMF, rating agencies, anonymous fund managers, suddenly materialize and grab nations by the throat. But do you want to know the weirdest part? Even after a total collapse, the game simply resets. Old debts are restructured, new loans are handed out, and the exact same machine starts running again under a new name. Brace yourself. These debts will never be paid off. Because in the 21st century, debt is not designed to be repaid. It is designed to be rolled over. When you or I borrow money, we lose sleep over it and want to pay it off as quickly as possible, right? But governments don't operate that way. In fact, paying off their debt completely is the last thing on their minds. In economics, this is called refinancing. When an old debt is due, they just borrow new money to pay off the old one. Think of it like a rolling subscription. The interest is simply the stability rent paid to keep the subscription active. Japan has been rolling over its debt for decades. Right now, its debt is over 250% of its GDP, yet its bond yields are still near zero. Why? Because nobody wants their cash back, they just want to renew the deal. That's because government bonds are the safest collateral, the ultimate safety net in the financial world. Imagine if Washington woke up tomorrow and decided to pay off every single penny of its debt. Do you know what would happen? The global economy would collapse in seconds. Banks and funds worldwide would lose their most secure assets. The dollar supply would shrink drastically, triggering a terrifying deflationary spiral, and the entire system would freeze. In short, paying off the debt would destroy the economy. This is why when politicians talk about balancing the budget or paying down the national debt, they are selling you an illusion. The goal is never to eliminate debt. It is to keep it sustainable, manageable, and attractive enough so that the world never stops believing in it. But there's a catch. You might think, well, that sounds great. Just print the money and keep the wheel spinning. But this trust and wealth are not distributed equally. As this debt spiral turns, where does the money for those massive interest payments come from? It comes from the pockets of everyday taxpayers like us. And where does it go? Straight to the massive institutions, funds, and ultra-wealthy individuals holding those bonds. As debt rises, the gap between the rich and the poor naturally widens. Money is constantly being transferred from the bottom to the top, from one class to another. At the end of the day, my friend, debt is no longer a burden to be avoided. It is the very architecture of modern life. Creditors aren't the villains, and debtors aren't the victims. They are just two sides of the same engine keeping the world running. The real question is, what happens when this engine can no longer find new debt to fuel itself, when the tank runs dry? That is the moment when the question of who is the creditor stops being a fun theory and becomes a deeply personal, painful reality. Because at the top of this pyramid, there isn't a single face to blame. It's not China, it's not Wall Street, and it's not the IMF. It's all of them, and it's us. The modern financial system has successfully turned debt into money. Governments print it, banks multiply it, investors trade it, and citizens depend on it. The line between debtor and creditor has blurred beyond recognition. Debt once meant bondage. Today, it means balance. But if that balance ever tips, and if confidence breaks, the illusion will end and we will finally remember